Okay, so good morning again, everyone. So today we prove two workhorses of quantitative public policy, the correlation and regression analysis. No? Grabe, ano? Two workhorses of quantitative public policy. Correlation and regression analysis. Okay, so correlation help us quantify the strength and direction of association between two variables. Say, citizen satisfaction and average processing time to permits. No? Regression goes further. It models how an outcome changes conditional on one or more predictors, enabling us to separate overlapping influences, estimating how digitization, staff size, and budget jointly relate to service delivery performance. For doctoral practitioners, mastery of these tools is not just technical, it's ethical. Take note of it. Your models with informed resource allocation, program continuation of or termination, no? Decision with real distributional consequences for communities. As we proceed, keep three principles front of mind, no? Meaningful theory, clean measurement, and careful identification. Let's now welcome our presenter who will walk us through the core concept, assumption, estimate procedure, diagnostic, and application of correlation and regression analysis, specifically no, in public administration.
Everyone. My name is Ninfa Di Mariano. I'll be reporting about correlation and regression analysis. Correlation and regression analysis are two fundamental statistical techniques used to identify relationships between variables, predict outcomes, and inform decision-making. In this report, we'll explore the concepts of correlation coefficients, regression models, and their application in understanding complex relationships. Through this analysis, we'll gain insights into how variables interact and influence each other, enabling us to make more informed decisions in various fields. To begin with, let's define correlation analysis. Correlation analysis is a statistical method used to measure the strength and direction of the relationship between two continuous variables. It helps to identify whether there is a significant association between the variables and the nature of that association. To simply explain it, it helps answer questions like, does one variable increase or decrease when the other variable changes? Or in simple terms, correlation analysis checks if there's a connection between two things. There are three types of correlation. Number one is the positive correlation. When one variable increases, the other variable also tends to increase. In other words, when one thing goes up, the other thing also goes up. You think of it like two friends walking together in the same direction. When one goes up, the other goes up too. An example is the height and weight. Taller people tend to weigh more. Another one is study time and grades. The more study time tends to mean better grade. In exercise and fitness, more exercise tends to mean better fitness. Number two is the negative correlation. When one variable increases, the other variable tends to decrease. To explain this one to an example, relationship between employee satisfaction and turnover rate. Studies have found a negative correlation between employee satisfaction and turnover rate, indicating that as employee satisfaction increases, turnover rate tends to decrease. To further explain, when employees are happy and satisfied with their jobs, they are less likely to leave the company, resulting in lower turnover rates. What is now the implication? Companies can reduce turnover by focusing on employee satisfaction through strategies like improving work environment, recognizing employee contributions, and offering competitive benefits. One is the no correlation, when there is no significant relationship between the variables. One example is height and favorite color. Height has no relation to favorite color. In research, no correlation indicates that the variables are independent of each other. When two variables are independent, it means that changes in one variable do not affect the other variable. Knowing the value of one variable doesn't help predict the value of the other variable. In other words, the variables don't influence or relate to each other in a predictable way. Example, your favorite food and your shoe size are independent variables. Knowing one doesn't tell you anything about the other. Let us go now to correlation coefficient. The correlation coefficient measures the strength and direction of the relationship between two variables. It helps researchers understand how strongly variables are related. We also have this perfect positive correlation. When one variable increases, the other variable increases exactly in proportion. Say for example, as hours studied increases, test scores increase perfectly in line with it. In research, it means a precise and predictable relationship between two variables. We also have the perfect negative correlation, when two variables move in opposite directions in a perfectly predictable manner. One simple explanation to that is that when one thing goes up, the other thing goes down perfectly every time. Example, the more you save, the less debt you have. They move in opposite directions perfectly. We now go to regression analysis. Regression analysis is a statistical method used to establish a relationship between two or more variables. It helps to predict the value of a continuous outcome variable based on one or more predictor variable, meaning it is a way to understand how different things affect each other. For example, how does the number of hours you study affect your exam scores? It helps you predict outcomes by looking at the relationship between two variables. Another example is that predicting your weight based on how much ice cream you eat. It looks at the relationship between ice cream consumption and weight to make predictions. We have two types of regression. Number one is simple linear regression. One predictor variable is used to predict the outcome variable. In simple explanation, it is a way to predict one thing based on another thing. Example, predicting your height based on your age. It finds a straight line relationship between the two things, helping you make predictions. Imagine you're trying to guess how much money you'll make based on how many hours you work. It helps you draw a straight line that best fits the relationship between those two things so you can make predictions. The second one is the linear regression. More than one predictor variable is used to predict the outcome. In simple explanation, it is a way to predict one thing based on several factors. Say for example, you are predicting house price based on number of bedrooms, square footage, and location. It helps you understand how each factor affects the house price and makes prediction based on all these factors combined. Another example is like you're predicting your final exam score based on how many hours you study, how much sleep you get, or how often you attend classes. It's look at all these factors together to make prediction about your exam score. Let us go now to the assumptions of regression analysis. Number one is linearity. The relationship between the variables should be linear. In simple words, the relationship between the variables should follow a straight line, not a curve. For example, if you're predicting weight based on height, linearity assumes that as height increases, weight increases at a constant rate. Further, the relationship between two things should be a straight line. One example, if you work more hours, your pay should be increased steadily. A straight line relationship, not a weird curve. Another example, the more apples you buy, the more you pay. If each apple costs 1 peso, buying 2 apples costs 2 pesos. 3 apples cost 3 pesos, and so on. The relationship is straight and predictable. Number 2 is independence. The observations should be independent of each other. In regression analysis, independence means that each observation or data point is separate and doesn't influence another. So in simple terms, each piece of data is unique and doesn't affect the others. Example, survey responses from different people are independent, but responses from same person at different times might not be. Each data point stand alone. Example, test scores from different students are independent. One student's score doesn't affect another. One is homoscedasticity. It is the variance of the error term should be constant across all levels of the predictor variable. In simple terms, the data points spread out evenly, not getting more or less spread out as you move along the line. Say for example, if you're predicting income based on age, homoscedasticity means the spread of income is similar for 20 years olds, 30-year-olds, and 40-year-olds. In simple layman's term, data spreads out evenly. Example, if you plot people's heights and weights, the spread of weight should be similar for short, medium, and tall people, not getting wider or narrower. The fourth assumption of regression analysis is normality. The error term should be normally distributed. The data follows a bell-shaped curve. Example, think of test scores. Most people score around the average with fewer people scoring really high or really low. The scores form a bell shape. Normality also explained as data clusters around the average. Example, heights of people. Most are of average height, some are tall, some are short, forms a bell curve. Another one is IQ scores. Most people scores around 100, fewer score very high or very low. The last one is no multicollinearity. The predictor variables should not be highly correlated with each other. It means that predictors don't overlap too much. Example, predicting house prices with square footage and number of rooms. These predictions are related but not too similar. If you use square footage and square meters, that would be multicollinearity. Another example, if you are predicting car value with mileage and number of That concludes my presentation, sir. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, no, madam. No, let me synthesize and extend the key points for our doctoral lens. No? First, correlation quantifies association on -1 to +1 scale. A faceted coefficient suggests that as one variable rises, the other tend to rise. No? A negative value suggests that the opposite. No? When typical use persons are for linear regressions or linear relationship among approximately continuous, normally distributed variables. No? Spearman's P or when ranks or monotonic but possibly nonlinear relations are expected, and Kendall's, of course, for small samples or outlier sensitive data. In a city hall, no, let's say for example, dashboard, for instance, we might observe R is equal to 0.62 between average permit processing days and satisfaction score. Strong evidence of an inverse linear association worth exploring. Second correlation is not causation. No? Compounding, reverse causality, simultaneity, and ecological fallacy can mislead. No? Suppose we find a positive correlation between LGU social media activity and citizen complaint. Is social media causing complaints, or do agency with more complaints communicate more? Without a casual design or richer modeling, correlation alone is an unreliable policy guide. Inter-regression analysis, so as our presenter, in simple linear regression, we estimate how an outcomes, yung processing time, let's say, changes with a single predictor, yung staff training hours. So multiple regression extend this to multiple predictors, providing training, digitization, index, and caseload. No? Coefficient are partial association and the estimated effect of a predictor holding other constant. This conditional framing is vital in government setting where many levers move simultaneously. Sound regression rests on key assumption, no? Approximately linearity between predictors and outcomes, independent observations, no? Homoscedastic errors, no? Yung constant variance, or else the use of heteroscedasticity, robust standard errors, and error centered at zero with no problematic multicollinearity among predictors. No? Diagnostic matter and use variance inflation factors to check collinearity. If residuals show curvature, introduce transformation like no lag of processing time, no, polynomials or splines to capture nonlinear structure. So for data common in public administration, tailor the model to the outcome. Logistic regression handles binary outputs. Let's say project success or project failure, no? Poisson or negative binomial regression, pit count outcomes, no? Let's say daily 8888 hotline complaints, no? Time index, no? Administrative data often required panel models like barangay by month, no? Enabling fixed effects that control for unobserved time in variance characteristics like institutional culture. So when evaluating reform rolled out at different times across LGUs, differences can strengthen casual interpretations under parallel trends assumption. A recurring threat is omitted variable bias if we regress satisfaction on digitization but ignore frontline staffing. Our digitization coefficient may be overstated. Conversely, adding too many weakly related controls inflates standard errors. So balanced theory-driven selections with pre-analysis plans and transparent reporting of alternative specification for the robustness checks, wherein endogeneity is suspected, like budgets rise in response to poor performance. Consider instrumental variables, but only with a plausible instrument that affect the outcome solely through the indigenous predictor or the formula-driven intergovernmental transfer shock. No? Interpretation should be substantive, no? Not merely statistical. Report effect size and marginal effects in policy units. Okay? Let's say, for example, no, a 10-point increase in the digitization index is associated with 0.0 day reduction in average permit time for 95% CI 0.4 to 1.2 days. No? Controlling for caseloads in staffing. No? Complement p-values with confidence intervals and where multiple outcomes are tested across health, education, and social protection indicators. Consider multiple testing adjustment or a clear prioritized family of outcomes. Measurement of quality, of course, is also considered. Omitted variable bias and pre-analysis plans. No? Interpretation should be substantive, not merely statistical, no? As I already mentioned. because public data are open, spatial, and temporal. No, neighboring LGUs may influence each others through spillovers, no, violating independence. No, consider cluster, robust, and especially robust and standard errors, and explore especially in econometric, no, models in morals, no. So I suggest special autocorrelations, no. So for time series, again, most commonly check stationarity and seasonality. No, use ARIMA or distributed lag terms when policy effects unfold over time. Or let's say pace rollout of an e-health system. No, so equity should be embedded in modeling, include interaction terms like digitization, multiply by rurality, program by income quantile, no, quintile, no. So to test heterogeneous effect and present distributional impacts like predictive processing times at the 10th versus 90th percentile of internet access. In evaluation, in evaluation of cash, let's say, for example, transfer programs, interaction with gender or disability indicators can reveal whether benefits are equitably realized. Distinguish prediction from interference. No? If your goal is forecasting case volumes to stop service counters next quarters, prioritize out of sample validation. Train test splits, cross-validation, MAA versus RMSE. No? If your goal is understanding policy levers, emphasize identification and interpretability, hybrid approaches regularize regression for variable selection, followed by a theory-driven inferential model are often pragmatic, no, in government analysis terms. For practical public sector example, let's say permit reform, no, right now we have permit reform, no, model average processing time as a function of digitization index, one-stop shop presence, a stop per 1,000 application and applicant mix, no, report marginal effects, check for heteroskedasticity, and non-linearity or the lag time. For health outreach, no, let's say, for example, logistic regression of child fully immunized on distance to RHU or yung mga regional health unit, no, mobile clinic availability, mothers education and conditional cash transfer participation, include barangay fix, effect to observe unobserved community trace. Right now, no, the disaster response, negative binomial regression of daily service requests on rainfall intensity, early warning coverage and LGU readiness score with cluster robust SEs at the municipality level. But before that, before we end, I just want to play a video presentation.
And simplify the oftentimes confusing world of academic research. My name's David, and today I'm chatting to one of our trusted coaches, Karen, about 6 tips to keep in mind to ace your inferential statistics. So, hey, Karen, welcome back to the Coach Cast. It's great to have you. Today we're talking about inferential stats.
Hi, David. Great to be back. Thanks for having me.
So today we're talking about those inferential statistics, and we've got a few tips in mind for everyone. And the first one is to ensure your hypotheses or models are clear and consistent with your topic. Karen, what are we looking out for here?
So I think there are a few things to consider, and the first and most important thing is, what is a hypothesis? A hypothesis for the vast majority of people is a statement, and it's a statement that often can be a statement of difference, a statement of change, a statement of a relationship. And there are many other things that a hypothesis can be, but those are for the vast majority of people what a hypothesis would look like. So something like group A differs from group B in some way, in a variable, or variable X is related to variable Y, like weight is related to height or something like that. And you could also have something like there's some change. So group A changes in some variable between time. Maybe it's their attention span or their knowledge of a subject or something that you're testing. And this is often a statement that differs from its counterpart, the null hypothesis, which is its opposite, if you will. We actually call it the null hypothesis being the dull hypothesis, because it's a statement where there's no difference, no change, no relationship to see here. And essentially what you're doing with a hypothesis is you're testing it. You're saying, hey, is there something to see here, in the sense that, is it different? Is it changed? Is there a relationship? If not, then you reject the hypothesis and you accept the alternative hypothesis. Or if there's no relationship or there's no change, then you will reject the one hypothesis and you'll accept the null hypothesis, and then vice versa. Essentially, these have to be testable in order for a hypothesis to even exist. So if you want to have a testable hypothesis, you need to make sure that it's very specific. So you need to make sure that one variable is related to another variable, ideally at its simplest, for more simplistic hypotheses.
I think that's really a good point, and probably an example of a less than ideal hypothesis is the more a person lifts, the bigger they'll be. Karen, what's sort of wrong there with that hypothesis?
Yes, so you're not being very specific, right? So lifting incorporates a lot of different things, a lot of different kinds of exercise, and bigness can be measured and evaluated in a lot of different ways. So a better hypothesis is one that will be much more specific. So something like, the more reps somebody performs a week in terms of bicep curls, the larger their bicep diameter will be relative to the time that they started, maybe the exercise program or something. In this context, you can measure the circumference or whatever it is for the biceps, and you can count the number of reps somebody does. So it ends up being far more specific and a lot easier to test yes or no. Whereas bigness, a whole bunch of things is related to maybe somebody's weight, somebody's overall size. There are a bunch of different kinds of lifts somebody can do that are related to that as well, if at all. Various things that are in your particular example that could be measured or that could be, impacting each other, that aren't really easy to test for, whereas something much more specific is a lot easier to test. And that's not to say that it can't be done. It's just to say that you probably need to at least unpack it into more specific variables. For me personally, I like it when there's some sort of direction to the hypothesis as well. So something like, instead of X is related to Y, X is positively related to Y, says that as X goes up, so does Y. Therefore, you've got a direction. Or in this context, the bigger the diameter of the bicep will be is a direction, because it's larger, not smaller. So something that is a little bit more specific tends to be a little bit easier to test, a little bit more theoretically easy to connect to the literature or to the theory behind it. And so I usually encourage something a little bit more specific even then.
I think that's really helpful when we think about sort of what a hypothesis is. But something that we should really keep in mind as well is that a hypothesis should be based on something observable, whether it's in the literature that previous research has found, or if it's as a result of practical observations. We're not just making a guess at something, right? That's not a hypothesis then, that's a guess. And so a hypothesis in general and in most academic research will be based on the literature or something that has been observed or quantified prior. So our second tip, and it's an important one, is to not neglect your descriptive or exploratory data analysis steps. And this is something we've kind of spoken about in a previous video, but Karen, maybe you can give us a little bit more detail about why we need to keep this in mind, specifically when we're working with inferential stats.
Yes, it is absolutely important to really consider your descriptive statistics and exploring your data before conducting your inferential statistics, mainly because the outputs, regardless of what software you're using, are quite complicated for inferential stats. And if you are trying to figure out what's going on, and it's not, the output that you're trying to consider, but maybe all of these other issues that you just never really considered initially, then that can lead to some problems. Some good things to look out for in these exploratory steps that, almost come naturally to that phase is things like, are the variables that are meant to be normally distributed and have a bell-shaped curve? Are your sample sizes appropriate for the various categories that you're wanting to compare? Are you understanding the kind of data that you're working with? Is the categorical data looking like categorical data? Is the scale data looking like it's meant to, like having some kind of, variation? And if you kind of don't know what I'm talking about, it's okay, but it's really important to at least have that initial intuition about your data before conducting the tests. Otherwise, you might come across some problems.
I think that's really good advice. And one thing we want to do is taking it further is think about cleaning and preparing your data. So when we were speaking about it earlier, having an intuition about the type of data you have and how it should be presented. If you've got a categorical variable that has 3 groups, red, green, and blue, if you do a descriptive analysis and see you have 6 groups because you've got a capital green and a lowercase green, that's a problem, right? That's going to throw out all your analyses. So we just want to do these exploratory analyses to identify issues before they're a problem, and also to help guide us as we move through subsequent statistical analysis. So our third tip really follows on from the previous one, and that's to ensure the assumptions behind your tests are met. So you've got a test you've got in mind. Each test has assumptions. Karen, maybe tell us a little bit more about this.
Yes, so a lot of people get a little bit scared about what do you mean I have to test some assumptions before even doing the test? But they're not very scary. They're just really common ones. There are some really common ones that are used for many tests. One assumption for a lot of common tests like the t-test or ANOVAs or linear regressions is that there's some kind of normal distribution to your numeric data set. So, and that basically means your data looks like a bell curve, which we sort of touched on in the previous session. This isn't, a strict thing in the sense that like your data, can be maybe a little bit more peaked or slightly skewed. As long as it's near normal, it should be fine. But if you've got a very skewed data set or one that has a weird bimodal distribution, it's got 2 weird peaks that are far apart, then that might actually impact your outcomes. It will impact your outcomes. And so it's worth just looking to see, does your data look like really wonky or maybe a little bit skewed? That's not bad, but it means you might need to think of a different test. Same with sample size. Some tests really require larger sample sizes than others. Often you're required to make sure that you get the adequate sample size before even analyzing your data. But some good ones to look out for is the chi-square test. Often you need a really big sample in order to be able to detect any differences. A third thing to look out for, in my opinion, is the data type. So making sure that if your test needs a categorical variable and a numeric and scaled variable, that you have those variables and the variables that you're wanting to test look like that. And if you don't, you might need to consider a different kind of test. And there are some resources that you can use online to see what kinds of variables you need to use, but we're not going to go into that for too much now. All of these kinds of tests that you need to sort of, maybe think about your assumptions doesn't mean that you can't do anything. So for instance, let's say your data is not normally distributed or that your sample size is not large enough. Then you might want to just consider a different kind of test. So for an ANOVA, if your data is not normally distributed, you might consider something like a Kruskal-Wallis. And if your sample size is not big enough, then you, instead of a chi-square test, you might want to consider something like a Fisher's exact test, which isn't as sensitive to sample size. So those are some things that you can maybe look at to maybe mitigate the problems that you might be facing with your data set.
I think it's important to note that every single test has its own assumptions, and it's very easy to feel overwhelmed. Oh my word, do I need to know every single assumption for every test? And the answer is very clearly no. There are a ton of resources out there online in stats textbooks that are going to give you all the information you need. But the important thing is that you go and check out what those assumptions are, and you figure out how you're going to test them and whether it's right. And an easy example of why this is important is you might want to be doing that ANOVA to compare categorical variables. But if your data is not saved or organized as a categorical variable, that can lead to problems in the interpretation. And so we just really want to be careful with these before we do the test, rather than trying to do it after the fact and getting really confused why nothing's working. So for our fourth tip, it's really something that's really near and dear to my heart, but no significance doesn't mean you've done something wrong. Karen, what am I getting at with that statement?
Hopefully this relieves you, but if you're doing quantitative research at all, it's because you're wanting to test something usually. And sometimes there's just no difference between groups or no relationships. And the null hypothesis, the dull hypothesis, is what your data is pointing to, and accepting. And that's just the way it is. That's why you did this research in the beginning, because there was an opportunity for it to go either way. Obviously, my first piece of advice is make sure it isn't something else. Make sure it isn't something like, your sample size is too small, or like, maybe there was the wrong test or the wrong assumption. Maybe you need to be a little bit less conservative or something with some of your choices. And those are some things to consider. But to be honest, it's fine if there's no significance. You can still have a good thesis if it's well executed. It's not going to be the most exciting thing, maybe, but it might be. It depends on what you're doing. But you can still pass, and you can still do very well. If it's about execution, it's about consistency. There are so many other things that come into play. If you describe your data well enough, and you have a significance value that's not significant, that's fine. That's why you did this research.
I can't agree more, especially because when we're marking dissertations and theses, we're not looking at, is it groundbreaking research? You're being assessed on, can you do research? Can you effectively convey your research? Can you argue it? Can you present it? So don't feel worried if you're not getting a significant result. That's totally normal. I will say it's way more common than you think it is. It's just unfortunate that most people don't publish non-significant results, but that's a whole different ballgame. What I will say, though, is don't feel always that those non-significant results means your research is a failure. Sometimes non-significant results are the most interesting results, particularly if they're contrary to what the literature is stating should be happening. That's then a great place for you to try and figure out what's happening. And that's where really exciting papers actually come from. So our fifth tip, again, follows on from the previous one, and that's when you are interpreting your significance, try and understand what that significance means. So Karen, what is the importance of the p-value or significance value?
Yes, and I'm guilty of this as well. We sort of just mindly accept what we call a cutoff threshold or a significance level as 0.05. Which means that if you get a p-value that is 0.04, it's significant, but if it's 0.06, it's not significantly different. And you can see why that's maybe a little, maybe not quite 100% very descriptive of what you might be seeing. So just because something is, significant or not doesn't mean anything if we can't explain that a little bit further. So it's really important to know what we mean by significance. If you choose a cutoff of 0.05, you're essentially saying that you are okay with a 5% chance that the value that you're going to be getting, if it is significant, is a false positive. That you're saying the outcome is significant when in actual fact it's not. It's just due to maybe sampling or, chance essentially. And this threshold of 5% or 0.05 is usually because of historical reasons that we don't really need to get into. But because of this, we need to really look at the p-value often with a little bit more depth. So for instance, if you ran one test and you had one hypothesis that you wanted to test and you had one t-test that you ran, and the significance value that you got was p equals 0.06, you probably do want to talk a little bit more about that. You probably want to say in your discussion that, hey, there's something going on here, that it's not significant at the cutoff level that I chose, but it is what we call approaching significance or near significant. And some people like that, some people don't like that, but it's valuable to say that maybe future research with maybe a larger sample size, maybe considering a few more alternative variables might actually be able to unpack this a little further and maybe even see significance where your test might not have done. Similarly, if you're running 20 tests, the chance of you getting a false positive is very high. So you actually want to be more conservative the more tests you run. So what we tend to do is we tend to lower that P threshold sometimes, or at least report on a lower P threshold, like P is equal to 0.001, in order to try to make more conservative examiners or statisticians happy, if you will. So if you're running a bunch of tests, rather consider if you can maybe put it into a single model or a single statistical test. Like instead of a bunch of t-tests, maybe consider a MANOVA or something like that. So just give it a little bit more thinking before running a bunch of tests. Or if you have to run a bunch of tests, consider lowering that P threshold just to be a little bit more conservative in your final discussion and outcomes.
I think it's also worth noting you don't have to feel like you have to just choose a critical threshold. So there are some great techniques out there on how to adjust for those multiple comparisons. The classic example is a Bonferroni correction, but there's other examples out there as well. You could do a Benjamini-Hochberg correction or a Holm-Bonferroni method. The clear answer is there are ways to deal with this. And if you're worried about it, if you're concerned about multiple testing, take a look at the literature and see what multiple test comparison corrections you can use. It's only going to help you going further. The other bit of advice that I have, and maybe it's not super commonly engaged within the literature, is you should be explicitly reporting your p-value. Don't just say it's less than 0.05. There's meaning to that data as well. So be specific. It's significant at that threshold, and my p-value was 0.0024. And that gives you some insight there as well. So for our final tip, and this again follows on from the last one, we want to be looking past our p-value. Karen, what should we be looking for other than that significance value?
Yes, so one mistake, we all do it, is we see the test outcome, we look at the p-value, and it's significant or it's not significant, and now what? But you have to be able to explain what is going on. And there are two things to consider in this. The first is to look at the other statistics. Don't just look at that p-value. There are other things to look at. For instance, if there is a difference between your groups, it's good to know which is bigger, which is smaller, right? You need to be able to understand that. And in that case, the exploratory statistics might come into play or something else. Maybe there is a relationship between your variables, but what is the relationship? Not just is it significant, but is it positive or is it negative? Is it a strong relationship and the variables really go across a single line? Or is it quite a weak and loose relationship? You don't get that from the p-value. You get that from the correlation coefficient or the R value. Or if you're doing a regression, maybe an R squared value. In this context, it's really important to then know that it's not just important that it's significant. It's important to also think about why it's significant, what that difference, what that relationship is, and how big it is. How big is that relationship? Is it very strong? Is it a big difference? And that is we normally referred to as effect size, more or less. A good example of this, and one that I really like, is that of breastfeeding research. There's a lot of research that has thousands and thousands of people in their samples, and they all seem to show that there's a significant difference when we look at samples of thousands of babies in terms of their breastfeeding and their IQ. Now, that seems pretty alarming, right? That means that, oh no, breastfeeding is really good. But if we look at the actual IQ points differences, we're talking about 1 or 2 points. And so at an individual level, we're not talking about a big impact on IQ. And it's something that can be mitigated or controlled with a bunch of other kinds of things that you can do for your child during their childhood or whatever. Maybe read to them before bed or something like that. It seems to have a much bigger impact. So in that context, effect size is probably far more meaningful in some cases than just the significance.
I think it's really a good point to think about this. This is often misused in sort of media reports on scientific articles. You'll see that sort of heading saying, oh no, double the chance of cancer if you do X, Y, or Z. But often enough, they haven't accounted for the effect size. So that double the risk is changing your risk from 1 in 100,000 to 2 in 100,000. So that's worrying, but not actually as alarming as you'd think. So it's important that as scientists, we report on effect size and really engage with it critically. We're not just using it as I'm doing it because I was told to. So Karen, thanks so much for joining us today. It was really great to chat to you about inferential stats.
Always fun to talk about stats, Dave.
All right, so that pretty much wraps up this episode of Grad Coach TV. Remember, if you're looking for more information about inferential statistics, be sure to check out our blog at gradcoach.com/blog. There you can also get access to our free dissertation and thesis writing mini course, which will give you all the information you need to get started with your research journey. Then don't forget, if you're looking for help with that analysis or dissertation, be sure to check out our one-on-one private coaching service, where you can work with one of our friendly coaches, just like Karen. For more information and to book a free consultation, head over to gradcoach.com.
Okay, so imagine no the power of statistics, no. So yes. Again, I have a lot of things pa to share related to statistics actually, no. Excuse. So correlation and regression are tools that help us understand how things are related and how one thing might influence others. Ganun lang kadali din ang correlation and regression. Again, correlation and regression are tools that help us understand how things are related and how one thing might influence other. Correlation is like checking if two things move together. When the number of online government services goes up, do citizen satisfaction score also go up? If yes, we say there's positive correlation. Regression digs deeper, no? It tries to measure how much one factor affects another while keeping other factors in mind. Let's say, no? Suppose we want to know how staff training hours, budget size, and digital tools affect the time it takes to process a permit. So a regression model can estimate how many days processing time drops for every extra the hour of staff training while holding the others factors ready. So sabi nyo, no, Doc, why it matters for public administration? If you're public administrator or possibly later on, these methods help you make better decisions. No? Let's say for budget planning, predict next year's spending by looking at past spending and economic indicators. If you are focused on program evaluation, let's say for example, mayroong mga PPP, 4Ps to PPPs, no? If you wanted to evaluate, no, let's say on disaster response plan, no, test whether a new e-health, let's say, platform really shortens clinic wait times, even after considering patient volume and staff numbers. For forecasting naman po, as public leaders, no, estimate how many citizens will need a service next month so you can assign enough staff. To cut in short, think of correlation as noticing that people buy more umbrellas when it rains. No? Regression is like asking if rainfall increases by 1 inch, how many more umbrellas will people buy, assuming prices stay the same? Both methods turns messy data into clear insights so government leaders can explain why something happens and plan smart evidence-based policy. Okay? So, excuse. So, correlation is your compass for initial relationship. regression is your map for navigating compounding terrain and estimating conditional effects. With rigorous diagnostic po, truthful identification, and equity awareness interpretation, these two tools help transform administrative data into defensible, humane, and effective public policy. So I think that's it.